for joining us in our final edition of this semester's Beyond KU panel series. We have once again a fantastic group of tremendous women here who I'm really excited to talk to, who all live, work, and breathe in the career of writing. And if you are watching live, feel free to comment. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, comment. If you have a question that you want to ask, throw it in the chat. And if we have time, we will absolutely do our best to try and get to it. But without further ado, let's have everyone introduce themselves. Nasha, you are the first one on my screen. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Nishia Baker. I'm the assistant digital editor at Martha Stewart Living Magazine and Martha Stewart Weddings Magazine in New York City. And in this role, I write across all of our content verticals. Some popular ones that I write in include celebrity news, beauty, health and wellness, and home. And I also work with just our other editors with our team to work in social media and also video, especially during the pandemic, making sure we're engaging with our readers as much as possible as people are staying, home a little bit more. So yeah, it's really great to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Kimmy, I've got you next.
Yeah, so I have a couple of different roles. I am a writing coach and editor for academic faculty, primarily in the allied health field, so like nursing and pharmacy and public health. And I help them to publish manuscripts and submit grant applications and do all the different kind of writing projects that are involved in academic life. And then I'm also involved in executive resume writing and LinkedIn profile development with a job coaching company called Briefcase Coach.
Wonderful. Paige?
Hi, my name is Paige Lytle. I'm a managing editor at Atria Books, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. As a managing editor, I work on every single book that Atria publishes, so between 200 and 250 titles a year. And I'm a part of the process from start to finish. So from the time we acquire the book and the manuscript is in to like finished books and books being in the warehouses or at all stores. I work with just about every department at S&S. So that's, our cover department, production, editorial, marketing, sales, warehouse, just about everyone. So I have my hands in a lot of different areas.
Wonderful. And finally, last but not least.
Hey everyone, my name is Deasia Page. I'm a reporter for the Belleville News Democrat in partnership with the Report for America. So right now I basically cover all of the Black communities in Southwestern Illinois.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. And like I said, students, if you're watching live and you have questions that you want to ask to the panelists, please comment if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, and we will try and get to those. Let's start off easy from the beginning. What drew y'all to this field? Has this been a passion of y'all's from the beginning? Is this something you discovered later in high school or in college? Anyone can jump in here.
I would say for me personally, I always was drawn to journalism from a young age, but specifically magazine journalism when I was at KU. I always read magazines growing up, and I realized that I always felt a connection specifically to this form of writing. I always tell people it's kind of like when you're getting advice from your best friend. I feel like that's the type of writing style that I see in magazine journalism. It's conversational, but it's still very informative. It still has just facts behind it, I would say. So that's something I really enjoyed, and I've really pursued that specifically when I was in college and through my career thus far.
I can go next. I knew that I always wanted to work in books, but I didn't think of it as an actual option until I was at KU, and I started as a poli-sci major and quickly learned that that was absolutely not for me. So I took a career class, and it said, oh, you should be an editor. And I was like, well, that makes perfect sense. I always knew that I wanted to, or that I loved reading books, and that was all I did as a kid. I didn't want to engage with, I wanted to read. So once I figured that, I started on the news info track in journalism at KU, and I did fall in love with news, but ultimately I did decide to pursue books. And I miss news every day, but books are cool too.
So I got into the field in a very roundabout way. So I have a PhD in American literature and have about a decade of experience teaching composition and literature at various colleges. But then when I had my daughter, she had some health needs, and I wasn't able to keep doing that. And so I was looking for ways that I could continue to work in something that I enjoyed, but from home. And I had worked in the writing center at UNC Chapel Hill as a way of expanding my approach to teaching, because there's a very different interaction that you get from teaching in front of a classroom versus teaching one-on-one with a student. So I worked in the writing center for several years there to kind of expand my teaching approach. And through that work, I got connected with a faculty member in the School of Nursing who was looking for that type of work, but there are no support structures like that for academic faculty, even though having someone give you feedback on your writing is valuable no matter how good of a writer you are, as most of y'all will readily know and admit. Like, having an editor and an engaged reader is extremely valuable. And so through that, I realized there was this huge demand in the health fields for engaged, informed writing feedback. And so I started working through that. And then a different opportunity emerged through a connection who had this executive resume writing company. And she is covered up in business with super top level CEOs that are looking to redesign their job letters and cover letters and resumes. And she works exclusively with women who have advanced degrees who, for whatever reason, can't use them in the way that they thought they would. And so she has this team of women, mostly mothers, who do about one resume a week and kind of keep their job credentials going that way. So that's how I got into it.
And for me, I would say I've always wanted to be a journalist since high school. And so when I went to college at KU, of course, I majored in journalism with the news and info track. And I always knew that I kind of wanted to write about race and culture and intersections of both. And so this job was kind of perfect for that, since I am covering specifically Black communities. So
Awesome. That's really interesting. So I'm curious, now that y'all are all working professionals, and you mentioned, when you kind of discovered this field, now that you're in it, what are some of the misconceptions that people have about the sort of things that you do? So, one thing that I always assume about someone who's writing is you have to be super creative. That's just a prerequisite, that you're always just got to be thinking really differently. And I imagine that is true sometimes, but not true all the time. And what are other things that, when you're telling friends or family, or maybe if you were talking to past you 10 years ago, what's something that people just assume that isn't quite the case about your work?
yeah, so for me, whenever I tell my family or even my parents, they think that, oh, so you want to be on TV? And I'm like, no, I don't want to be on TV at all. Like, that's not what I want to do. People don't really understand that there are so many avenues, of journalism and in the journalism field that people don't really understand. So I would say that's the biggest one that I've encountered.
And for me, oh, sorry. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. A huge one for me is that everyone thinks that I must just check people's grammar all day long, and that I'm a glorified grammar checker as an English teacher and as a writing coach. And that's not what I do at all. I mean, I will give you feedback on your grammar if that's what you want, but it's more formative feedback to help you articulate the idea that you're trying to put out into the world.
One of the misconceptions that I even had about publishing was that there is one job and it's editor, and that there's no other options. And then I fell into this role as managing editor, which was perfect because I am not a creative person, and I'm okay with that. People are like, oh, I'm sure you're a creative problem solver. And I'm like, I don't even know if that's true. I like schedules. I like logistics. I like very concrete things. And there's so many different sides of that in publishing that aren't just oh, you're an editor, you're working with content. That's very creative. So, yeah.
And I would just say, just to add on to what everyone else was mentioning, the industry is ever growing. I feel like they're kind of like what you just mentioned, Paige. There are so many different avenues in journalism, even in the magazine journalism space. You can really work in print specifically, but there also are other opportunities to write as an editor besides just the traditional route.
Sure. Well, and that's a great segue into the next question of how has your work, or how has the field evolved even just over the last couple of years? Nasha, you mentioned how you do a lot in the digital space as well. Is that something that was a desire that you had, or was, has it kind of just transformed into like, oh, I was, wanting to be that magazine writer, and all of a sudden I'm getting into the video space and I'm doing all these things with social media. How has your field evolved? And that's for everyone as well.
Yes, so just touching on just the beginning aspect. So I did seek out writing editorially specifically. So I still writing is my 9 to 5, but I do get to dabble a little bit more, particularly because of the pandemic. We just want to think of different ways where we can connect and show our readers just more of like the editor side, what we do, what we can do. We just do some projects, we do some things creatively through video, but I would say just probably 10 years ago, even I'm sure just print was like the only thing people probably thought about the magazine space, but you can write way more as an assistant digital editor, which is the position that I'm in, and we're able to really be able to connect with readers, think about different pitches that really would connect with people. So I would say it's definitely evolved specifically with the industry that I'm in.
We also have, where for publishing, like, of course, it's ebooks like that. Those came out of nowhere, and everyone thought print was going to die, but print never dies. But sales exploded for ebooks, and since they've like plateaued because people still love the like a physical book in your hand, and now we're seeing audiobooks get even more and more popular. But it's interesting to see how like print has stayed steadily high since that initial like ebook boom.
So in my space, which is more of that educational space, I think the huge shift has been with the pandemic. Like everything was in person. So all of my interactions with students and clients were in person, and now it's all virtual. And I think that's actually been really empowering for the faculty that I work with, because trying to coordinate schedules to meet in person is quite difficult. Whereas most people can fit in an hour-long video meeting in between a couple of other things that are happening. So I think the interesting development for what I do is that it's become easier to do it.
Say for online journalism, I guess within the past 5 to 10 years, maybe the biggest shift has been like more focus on SEO and ensuring that people on social media and online read your stories. And so that's been something that I've learned even within like the few months that I've worked in my job. And so we're always trying to find creative ways to reach audiences beyond just the online and the print version of what we write. So yeah.
Sure. I'm curious. So, we get to talk with students all the time here at the Career Center, and obviously y'all have wonderful experiences. And when I was getting to look at your different profiles for this panel, all the different places that you've worked, and I'm curious though, what are some of the skills that either you think you're able to bring to the table, or maybe you see in colleagues who they really stand out? But what sort of skills really help someone stand out in this field?
So in the writing composition space, a skill that is super valuable is if you have experience writing in something other than English. So it makes sense. Most English teachers and composition teachers and writing coaches are people who primarily have written English literature, but most writing is not English literature. So in our space, it's increasingly going to helping people develop the skills to write anything that they need to write in life, which is very broad. And so if you have published or have vast experience in like scientific writing or social sciences or engineering, anything else that you can connect with a different writer who's writing a lab report or a journal article is super valuable.
For me, it's a lot of the basic things like time management and prioritization. That's stuff that we deal with on a daily basis. The one thing that I didn't consider until I had the job was how much we have to manage personalities. We're dealing with, very important editors or very important authors, like maybe not directly, but indirectly. And it's a joke in our department that we're basically the company's therapist. So we have to make sure everyone feels heard, and then, hit them with the truth or whatever. It's a lot of, working with people and managing their personalities, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, I'd say, I guess the more well-rounded you are, the better. So, I mean, in addition to, having experience in writing, it would be good if you also have experience in production or social media analytics or photography or anything else, just because I think that there are more ways to just tell one story. And so I think the more experience you have in those other fields of journalism, the better it will be for you. So.
And then just to piggyback on what you mentioned, Deasia, and also Paige, so I guess first is being a people person is really helpful. We do interact with so many different just people for our sources. Sometimes they're celebrities, sometimes they're just experts in the field. So you just need to interview a lot of people. So you want to make them feel as comfortable as possible. And also you're just interacting with just your fellow editors on a daily basis. So just wanting to be a great member of the team is just really a great priority to have as well. And then also just in digital, you want to make sure you're informed about different content management systems. As you mentioned, DH, like SEO, different analytics systems. So those things are definitely all helpful for the magazine field as well.
Nice. That's really interesting. This may, maybe this will be a little repetitive with your answers, but I'm curious, but what do you find hardest about your job just on a daily basis? Maybe it's something that happens infrequently, or, maybe it is just constantly having to manage the different personalities, but what are some of the biggest challenges that y'all face?
I wouldn't say this is necessarily a challenge, but it's something just to keep at top of mind. Just always being on top of news. So depending on the publication that you work for, you have to know if something's popping, like you just need to make sure you're relaying it to your editors in a timely fashion, because you're still trying to make sure you're getting things out quickly. You want to be the publication to deliver, make sure you're getting the most traffic for something. So I would say that's something that's just important to always remember for my field.
That's kind of similar for me in a way that I wasn't expecting. Simon & Schuster is known for nonfiction books. We do a lot of heavy nonfiction, and the nature of those books are sometimes they're very rushed. I worked on one book recently that it was reporting on Trump, and then things kept happening. So the delivery date for the manuscript kept moving, like coronavirus hit, and then the whole book changed. So it was trying to stay on top of the news that was happening, and we still have a printer date to hit. So it's a lot of juggling different aspects of the book, and where do we cut time? Who gets less time with this part of the manuscript? Which accounts don't need the books? That kind of thing.
I think kind of bringing up something that Paige said for the last answer, the biggest surprise to me is how much helping someone with writing turns into therapy, because the barriers that people have to writing often don't have to do anything with the writing itself. It's time management, or my family upset me, or I'm not getting enough sleep. And I think that was the most surprising to me, is to realize how agile I had to be at not being their therapist, since I'm not a licensed therapist and don't want to be a licensed therapist, while validating what's going on with them and then pivoting them to, and what can we do about it in terms of writing?
I say for me, this is more of a personal challenge, but finding sort of a work-life balance has been something I have yet to conquer since entering this field. With news, it's just so demanding because, your time revolves around the news, and that could be any time of the day. And so it's hard for me to kind of adjust to, this is setting this time aside for working and setting this time aside for me. So that's been something that I'm still trying to figure out, but just learning to, just try to balance the two has been important. So.
Oops, I was on mute still. That's really interesting. So for those of you who are watching live, if you have questions, please feel free to comment in the YouTube or Facebook live streams, and we will try and get to them. I am curious, Paige, you mentioned this, and this is just a question of ignorance. How often do y'all find those deadlines get moved because of extraneous events? And I'm just curious, maybe this was just a really obvious answer for everyone watching, but, what are some of the steps that you have to take when, okay, that news event happened, so we need to push the manuscript deadline. Deasia said you just came right off deadline here. What are some of the things that you do when that thing out of left field comes in, and what are some of the things that you maybe recommend to students as they're practicing to get into this field to handle those, I'm sure, tight pressure situations?
So for books, we see these deadlines move all the time. Like I have a grid that I keep of like, well, this is the date that I was told I would get it, and here are the 10 times it's been revised, just to show everyone like, well, this has how much it's moved. And it's as much, it can go from like, there's more news that happens, so the manuscript needs to change, or something's changed in the author's personal life that has kept them from writing. It's a lot of different aspects. And what we try to do is just figure out like, well, does it have to be published on this date, or can we move it out, or how much time do we need for this? There's a lot of different aspects of the book's production schedule that we can like cut time out of. It just depends on what sales needs and what publicity needs. I think for me, in terms of advice to give, is that I'm like the liaison between all of these departments, but I can never make these decisions on my own. So whenever I hear these this news come in that like, oh, the author can't make their deadline, I'll go to the people that it affects, and we get in one room, and one Zoom room at this point, obviously, and we talk about like, what all can we do? So just, I think, asking for help and knowing like the right people to go to, like all the people who play a role in or have like a vested interest in this, getting their opinion. So that way you can make an informed decision and go back and be like, okay, well, here's how we can make this happen, or here's how it's just impossible. That's a very book specific example. So news is different.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I was on deadline. It was for a breaking news story that wasn't obviously on my to-do list for today. So it's hard to like, put everything on the back burner for this one story. But I guess, the advice on how to sort of navigate that for me would just be to kind of just like practice doing that more. Because it's one of those things where the more you practice doing it, the more you'll get better. At least that's what has worked for me. And I know in KU journalism, they do offer classes on like breaking news writing. And so I would say just practice that more, because you will get better at it. I'm sure of it, because if I can, then somebody else can too. So, yeah.
I would say, just to add on to that, in terms of breaking news, like Deja mentioned, just practicing is great. I do think also just communicating with your editors, because I know different teams are different. So sometimes there's a time specific, like what time they want the story to be finished. That's probably also helpful. It's just communicating and just thinking about that when you're approaching the industry. And then also just in terms of this like long form stories that might be pushed back. That happens on occasion. It doesn't usually happen too often. But if it does, it's usually my deputy editor or just one of like the executive editors who's making a specific decision to put something off for a bit of time. But that's usually not an issue. It's just practicing again, just making sure you just have all the information ready. And then once it's ready for the published date, everything should be set.
And I'm in quite a different position than the three of y'all. I'm an independent contractor for all the work that I do. So I have a Trello project management board, and I set my own deadlines, and I either accept or don't accept the projects depending on what's going on in my life. The most I can think of is occasionally the woman I work with will call up and say that she's had someone else get sick, and is it possible for me to do something on a tighter deadline than I would usually take? And I just evaluate whether or not I have that capacity, and I either do or don't. So that is a really great benefit of being a contractor. If it works for your life, you get to decide when you do things or not.
Sure. So one question that I'm a little curious about is, in your respective careers, has there ever been sort of a teachable moment or a hurdle that you faced, or something that has challenging in the moment but really sets you up down the road? Because I think we found here at the Career Center that students in a lot of cases are not necessarily finding a lot of those hurdles until they get into the working world, that they've had success in most stages of their career up until they graduate. And obviously that's not everyone's experience, but how do you recommend students handle those, initial hurdles that, maybe they weren't expecting?
Again, I think it's just communicating with your team. I really think that, especially when you're early on, I think the editors you're working with understand that you're new, and they just want to make sure you're on the same page. So if it is a hurdle, I would just stay grounded, just make sure you know it's just growing from it, and just thinking ahead about just different ways you continue to communicate. I think is just the biggest piece of advice I would have.
Yeah, I really don't think you can ask too many questions when you're first starting out. Like it feels like, oh, maybe I'm bothering them by asking, but it really just shows that you're very interested in the work that you're doing and you want to learn and you want to be good at it. So like cut out the chance of like making a mistake by not asking the question and just, putting yourself out there.
Yeah, I'd also add just finding those support systems maybe outside of the organization that you work for. Because, for instance, I'm a part of NABJ, which is the National Association of Black Journalists. And I found that they've been, helpful in ways that sometimes my job wasn't. So I think just finding those different support systems would be helpful as well. So.
And to kind of echo that, if you decide to go into writing in the more academic space, I think it's important to realize that there's a very different mindset to teaching undergraduates than teaching graduate students. So if your career in writing is that you go on to be a graduate student who plans to write in an academic way, they're then trying to treat you as their peers. And so students who have previously excelled with no problem suddenly get crushed because the mindset changes from, oh, you're a unique flower that we're developing, to you're a potential peer that we want to tear apart. And it's not as personal as it seems. It happens to everyone. But a lot of people really struggle for those first 1 to 2 years of graduate school because they've always been excellent students, which is why they went to graduate school. But suddenly they're no longer getting praised.
Sure. That's really interesting. So I know some of y'all are journalism majors and some of y'all had English degrees and just had a wide array. But is there something looking back that you wish you had more practice on, or something that you had more exposure to, whether it was, getting involved in a certain organization, or, we talked about how we're pioneering into the digital space that you wish you had more familiarity with? Is there something that, looking back, like, oh, if I had been a little bit more familiar with this or had a little bit more practice, that might have been something that made that initial transition into the working world easier?
I think for me, I literally never darkened the door of any kind of practical class. So like no business, accounting, marketing, like nothing that matters in a business context. And then when I write executive resumes, they use all of this lingo that I've never heard of before. And it would just be really helpful to, if you are a writing person that exists in that liberal arts bubble, get out of your bubble and like learn something about business before you get thrown into it.
I would say I was a J school graduate, and I really had a great experience. I do think the industry has changed so much even since I've graduated. So I think when I was in school, we did have some experience in print, also in digital, and I was involved with different publications on campus as well. So I feel like I had my feet wet. But I would say one aspect that is really important with the work that I do is pitching. So really understanding how to pitch for different publications would be really helpful, I think, for students right now, because the voices are so different, the content that different publications really publish, it's very different. So understanding that process, I think, will be really great for students, something that I think would have been helpful as well.
I think I definitely should have taken more English classes, considering I wanted to work in books, but I was really excited about the prospect of, studying journalism. And I worked at the Kansan, and I definitely wouldn't trade any of that, but the English classes definitely would have helped me a little more. I do think I landed this job partially because of luck, because my boss went to KU and worked at the Kansan, so that was like a shoo-in, but I think more classes would have been helpful.
Yeah, I would say because my background is more in news, but I'm also interested in more feature writing and magazine writing. So maybe if I took maybe more English classes, or if there were more classes in the J school catered to like feature writing and magazine writing, then I definitely would have taken more advantage of that, because that would have helped me now. So.
Nice. Well, we're slowly going to get to the end. I want to be respectful of y'all's time. You've been so generous in sharing your insight with us. What just one or two final questions for you. What is something that is really unique about working in a role like yours in an organization like yours? Just something that maybe it's the reason you got into this industry, or maybe it's just something that you got into it like, oh, this is kind of cool, or this is just different. Does anything come to mind when I pose that sort of question?
So, to my knowledge, I'm the only person doing the kind of work that I do. So I'm sure there must be someone out there doing it too, but in the network that I'm a part of, no one else is providing this kind of tailored academic writing, coaching, and editing to faculty members. Most schools have undergraduate and graduate school writing centers, but kind of assume that like once you're in faculty, you don't need that, but that's not true. Like the same writing struggles happen to the emeritus professor that happen to the first year college student. They just tend to happen on a more epic level because that person's more confident and let it fall apart. But yeah, I think that there's a huge market out there if someone was interested in it for that kind of work.
And for me, I'd say just to kind of relate to what Kimmy was saying, that for me, I'm the only Black reporter in my newsroom, which I didn't know prior to coming there. But while it also kind of adds a significant amount of pressure on me to do what I do, but I think at the same time, the communities that I cover, if I weren't there, like nobody else would be covering the daily news that happens around them and, what's going on in their lives. So I feel sort of like an obligation to continue the work that I'm doing, even though there is still that struggle of being the only, Black reporter there. So.
I work semi on the production side, so we see a lot of really interesting requests come in from authors for like, oh, well, what if we could do this kind of thing? So this is an extremely book specific example, but just the things that we've had to talk to printers about, like, oh, is this even possible? Like, can this author shoot a bullet through his entire book and we put it on sale? And I'm like, also maybe not the time to do this right now, because it was a couple months ago. I was like, what if we didn't talk about this ever? But there's like a lot of like overzealous authors and, publicity teams. Like there are a lot of really interesting ideas that you wouldn't think possible, but we can do it sometimes.
And then I would say for me, one of the most unique things about the publications that I work for is just like, I think the content that I'm able to write is really fulfilling because of like who I get to interview, who I'm featuring. Since I write across the different content verticals, able to just write about people of color specifically, it's always my priority. And it was really no question when I began, just knowing people of color experts in every industry, and just being able to highlight people who are just the best and well-versed, and just spotlighting them is just a really amazing thing for me. And then in terms of my company as a whole, we have just different resource groups, and I'm a part of our Black resource group called Black Print, and I work with editors across every publication, so InStyle Magazine, People Magazine, and many others at our company. We have just a really great community of just Black women who are working together and just building each other up. It's really fulfilling, and just spotlighting people, just African Americans across the media industry as a whole is just really amazing as well.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Well, final question that I want to leave for y'all is, just trying to end on an uplifting note for those who are watching is, what's your favorite thing about a typical day? Maybe it's something you've already talked about, just something that you really enjoy, or, if nothing comes to mind or you've already talked about it, what's something that you want to impart to the students who are watching?
My favorite thing about my job is just the vast amount of people I get to talk to in a day. Like I will go from a meeting with my production team to a meeting with my publisher to one with sales. Just getting to see all those different sides, like I've already mentioned, is really fulfilling. And especially when a book that we're working on, like maybe it's a debut author, they're obviously written anything before, when like they get a big award or a big nomination, and then everyone in the sales team like rallies around this book and we build this author from the ground up. It's so exciting. Like even when I'm on the more technical side, just being able to be a part of that process to build like this next big star is is so amazing. I love it.
So pretty related to that. I think the best part of my job is I have long-term relationships with these faculty. I've been working with one woman for probably 4 or 5 years, and seeing those weekly investments pay dividends into their long-term career goals. So when they get tenure or when they land the massive NIH grant that they cried over last summer because they were so despondent about it, and then they call you up and they're like, I got funded. It's great.
And for me, I'd say the best part is just building that relationship with the people that I cover in those communities. Because as I mentioned, like the communities that I cover, they're not used to having their own journalist who's going to hold them accountable, but also like write about what they're going through on a daily basis in their towns. And so it was just like a warm welcome from them because they just never had that journalist in their areas before. So I think that's been the best part of like sort of building that professional relationship with those people that I cover.
And then also for me, I would say the best part of my just typical day would just be writing, of course. I mean, I think it's really fun being able to put a piece together with, kind of as I mentioned, just experts across every industry and just entrepreneurs, people who really built their careers from the ground up, or maybe they're celebrity influencers, or just so many different people that I'm able to really blend their stories and just make this piece come to life. It's a really beneficial and just like exciting thing to be a part of.
Wonderful. Well, once again, thank you all so much for joining us. For those students who are watching, if you want to learn more, if you're in the midst of your own career journey and wanting to have assistance in, getting to one of the places that these outstanding panelists are, reach out to us, career.ku.edu. We'd love to set up a career appointment with you, look at your resume, help you with your career planning, regardless of what stage you are in. We are here to help you. So once again, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. It was great.